Perfect.
Hi, to all who are new here, my name is Dr. Michelle Haney, and I'd like to welcome you to Releve Sports Medicine's Virtual Journal Club. For additional webinar educational opportunities, you can visit our website and register directly for the webinar or sign up for the email list to be notified of upcoming webinars. We are continuing to update our schedules, so check back often. For all athletic trainers who are intending to get live CEUs from the BOC, you will receive an email 1 hour after the webinar concludes, which includes a link to the combined quiz, evaluation, and assessment. You'll have up to 72 hours to complete the quiz and the evaluation. This email will come from customercare@gotowebinar.com. Please ensure that this is done to receive your statement of credit. If you don't receive the follow-up email or you have any other concerns, then contact us via our email at journalclub@relevesportsmedicine.com. Once the statement of credit is available for download from our website, you will receive an email notification. If you have any questions during the webinar, please submit the question and we will review questions at the conclusion of the presentation. If you cannot see the PowerPoint slides and you're accessing the webinar from your mobile phone, swipe the screen to the left or to the right and the slides will become visible. The recording will be available for review from our website tomorrow. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Katie Wojnowich, who is a sports medicine physician with Bayfront Health, part of the Orlando Health Network, and Sports Medicine Fellowship Director. She attended Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts and graduated from medical school at Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York. She completed her residency and fellowship at Bayfront Health. She has published numerous articles and book chapters on sports medicine topics. She is also an avid runner in her spare time. She will be speaking today about nutrition in endurance athletes. All right, and I'll have you take it away.
Thank you. And so I'm sorry, Michelle, since this is my first time, should I minimize this webcam so that you guys, that's not in the center of your screen, or do you see that, or do you just see the slides?
They'll see just the slides, and then if they slide to the left and to the right, then they'll see either you or the slides, but not both.
Okay, perfect. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't getting in the way of anything. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. And this, I think, as I've told you before, I think one of the benefits of the pandemic has been that we've been able to sort of collaborate with people much farther away. And so have been able to get all of these really wonderful perspectives and variations in treatment and just new ideas about things that we wouldn't normally have because we'd be sort of tied more towards our own local community. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to share, and I look forward to participating and to hopefully giving you guys some good information on nutrition and endurance athletes. And really my goal is for this for this to really be practical information so that when you're seeing an athlete and they're coming to you with, whatever they read in Runner's Magazine, or, when we get to the Olympics this summer, hopefully, and we start hearing about various athletes like nutritional supplements and things that they do, and then your athlete comes back to you and says, is this something I should be doing or not? You'll be able to offer some expertise and to give them just the quick updates about what they should be doing. And so as Dr. Haney said, I am the Sports Medicine Fellowship Director here at Bayfront, and I practice here in St. Petersburg. So without further ado, we'll move forward. All right, so I have no relevant financial relationships to disclose. I'm not discussing any products specifically in my presentation, and Releve Sports Medicine also does not have any financial or other associations, so you can read this, but we have no disclosures here. And really my goal for you guys is to understand our general nutrition recommendations for athletes and understand additional nutrition considerations for endurance athletes. What specific macro or micronutrients might they need different quantities of compared to the general population. We're going to review some recent nutritional trends and discuss potential pitfalls for our endurance athletes, things that they may want to watch out for. And hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll have a comfort level with discussing nutrition habits with your athletes. We know that participation in endurance events is growing nationally and globally, and it's growing in both the sort of traditional means, which would be things like the marathons and your Ironmans, ultra marathons, and then you have these non-traditional events that are gaining in popularity as well. mud runs, Spartan races, ultra endurance events. All of these kind of create unique demands on the body and require sort of a unique nutritional approach to ensure that your athlete is being properly supported during their races. We know that with prolonged activity, nutrition becomes an important component of training, you know, not just sort of that preparatory phase that we think about classically with our athletes, right? So especially if we're covering sports athletics, your athlete might be participating in, you know, a 90-minute or a 2-hour game, but they're taking breaks. They're not going that whole time necessarily. With our endurance athletes, they may be training for several hours a day, and their race may be several hours of continuous, you know, athletic, you know, participation. And so we have to think just not only about kind of pre-race nutrition, but also race nutrition and then recovery nutrition as well. It's important that we're paying attention to our macronutrient intake, that we're paying careful attention to hydration status, which I am going to sort of consider in nutrition, although obviously water doesn't offer any, you know, caloric benefit, and then certain supplements that may or may not be appropriate for your athletes. And we'll also talk about appropriate nutrition because, like in the macro sense, because that does help to improve recovery, prevents an energy deficit, right, where you end up getting into that catabolic phase and breaking down all of the hard work that you've been working for, and reduces fatigue so that they're better able to push through that race or get ready for the next training session tomorrow. So nutrition is really vitally important to make sure that your athletes are ready to go and ready to endure and persevere. We know that there have been numerous dietary trends reported in the popular media, right? I'm sure we have all seen these trends, and anyone that's gone to any sort of sports health conference has heard about all sorts of diets. You know, you've got your ketogenic diets, you've got your high-fat diets, your low-fat diets, your high-carb diets, your low-carb diets, your intermittent fasting, all sorts of things. And so we have numerous athletes that, based on like an N of 1 or one athlete's claim that that's made the difference between first place and 10th place. So then all of our athletes are coming in asking us, you know, is this diet right for me? And the answer is that there's really pretty sparse research supporting any particular diet, certainly within the athletic world. And there's oftentimes conflicting advice, right? You can log on and you can see that ketogenic diets are perfect for endurance athletes, and you can also see, you can find another article that states that they are like the worst thing that you can possibly do. And it's challenging for our patients and for our athletes when they're presented with all of this conflicting advice, and it's challenging for us when we're trying to kind of weed through all of that information and figure out what makes sense. Sports nutrition really remains an evolving field, and as we talked about, what was recommended last week might not be recommended tomorrow, and so many experts will debate the ideal diet for endurance athlete. I think one of the challenges that often comes into play with many of these kinds of diets in the research is that they may be looking, you know, you may see theoretical benefits or you may see benefits in the lab, but then it really doesn't translate to an actual competitive advantage on the field or you know, on the road. And so should we be asking our athletes to adhere to these really restrictive diets for a questionable athletic advantage? And probably not. So we'll talk through some of that and kind of give you some better tools to help guide your patients or your athletes when you're helping them to develop a nutrition plan. So just so that we can all be on the same page, I like to think about diets in just a couple of different ways, and so, or the components of the diet in a few different ways. So we have our macronutrients, right? And these are really just three things. They're carbohydrates, proteins, or fats. They're our main building blocks that we use in large amounts to supply energies, right? So the body can get energy from those three sources, and our diets are going to be a combination of those three things, really, if we want to kind of just simplify it. Sorry, there's a competing meeting going on, so I apologize for some of the dings here, but hopefully it's kept to a minimum. If I need to, I can log out and fix that. But with regards to micronutrients, these are our essential elements that are needed by the body in really very small amounts to perform necessary physiologic function. And these are our vitamins and our minerals. So vitamin D, vitamin E, vitamin C, magnesium, those might be some that might be thrown around. We really need them in very small amounts, but they are, of course, vital and necessary for proper physiologic function. And then supplements would be separate. Those are just substances that are taken to improve performance or recovery. And so supplements can be everything from, what we would classically maybe think of as supplements like testosterone and things that obviously offer an advantage but would not be recommended, to things like various vitamins may be considered a supplement, as well as like caffeine would be considered a supplement. So we'll talk through that. So let's first talk about sort of our general recommendations for our macronutrients when we're talking about athletes. So with regards to carbohydrate recommendations, which I'm going to abbreviate as CHO, we recommend that for an athlete who's exercising 1 to 3 hours daily, they need about 6 to 10 grams per kilogram per day. An athlete who's exercising for 4 to 5 hours daily would need 8 to 12 grams per kilogram per day. So if you had a 150-pound athlete and they're shooting for that mid-range because they're exercising maybe for 4 hours every day, they would need to consume 680 grams of carbohydrate daily. And this is just some examples at the bottom of how you could obtain 50 grams of carbohydrate. So here would be sort of a more, I guess, a classic consideration of carbohydrates with your simple carbohydrates: white bread, pasta, potatoes, rice. Here's another example of 50 grams of carbohydrates from some nuts and legumes. So you can see quite a large volume, right? And this is just 50 grams. So just a drop in the bucket of the 680 grams of carbs. Here you have some vegetables, some fruits. I also have included here just a picture from the back of a Cliff Bar. And so if you're able to kind of read on down here to the total carbohydrate dosing, that's 45 grams. So one Cliff Bar will deliver almost 50 grams of carbs too. And so I'm sure, as I am thinking too, I'm sure you're thinking like, wow, 680 grams of carbohydrates, that seems like a lot of calories of just carbs. If I'm looking at this picture of bread, 50, so I would need like 14 servings of that. That's wild, right? And a couple of things, many of your nutrition intake is not going to be strictly carbs or strictly protein or strictly fat. So understand that while yes, it's a lot of carbohydrates overall, this also will contain some of your daily
All right, it appears as though Dr. Wojnowich's screen froze. She is working on logging back in.
Crazy security stuff that I feel like makes.
All right, we're having a little technical difficulty here. What I am going to do, Dr. Wojnowich got kicked off one computer somehow, and so she is logging into another computer. And
Work.
okay.
I'm trying to open this now, so. It's letting me connect, so it should okay.
And there you are, yes.
Okay.
So let me make you the presenter. Oh, right there. Yes, and we are back onto your screen. We're just
Okay,
waiting on your volume.
Okay, sorry. Now can you hear me?
Oh, wait, you're popping up. I'm gonna hang up.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Are we back? Okay, I'm sorry about that. So let me know if, hopefully this works, sorry. Okay, let me know how much of this you got, but basically this is a lot of carbohydrates. But remember that somebody's exercising continuously for 4 to 5 hours daily with this amount of carbohydrates. And so remember that, you know, if you looked at pictures of how much Michael Phelps was eating in a day, it kind of syncs up, it makes sense. And it's really a struggle for our athletes to try to get in that many calories to be able to support proper anabolic function. Okay, and just as a reminder, a brief reminder kind of what, sorry, I'm just gonna do this so I can see my slides, I apologize. A brief reminder of what we need carbohydrates for, metabolism summary. I like this graphic a lot. You don't have to go back to the basic science, but know that the reason that carbohydrates have been our go-to forever is that they generate more ATP per volume O2 than any other source that we can provide. So fats are an excellent sort of storage container of unused energy, and that's part of the excitement with ketogenic diets, just that they store a ton of potential energy. But in terms of your go-to sort of rapid energy production source, carbohydrates are it. They exist basically in two forms within the body. They exist as glucose, which is our sort of ready to use form, and that's what we get when we ingest any form of carbohydrates. And then as glycogen, which is the storage form that gets stored in the muscle and liver. You know, that being said, there's a finite ability, right? Once you utilize all of the glucose that you've ingested and that you've sort of stored in the muscle and the liver, it's gone. And when it's gone, then your performance is going to suffer. But just as a brief reminder, that carbohydrates are definitely the most readily available and what your body prefers to utilize for all intents and purposes here. Let's see. Uh-oh. Okay, good. Oh, good. Now let's move on to kind of our general recommendations for protein. Our recommendations for the general population is about 1 gram per kilogram per day. For endurance athletes, it bumps up to about 1.4 grams per kilogram per day. For resistance training athletes, it might be up to 1.6 grams per kilogram per day. So just as a frame of reference, an athlete who's 150 pounds, if we're going back to our previous recommendations, they would need to consume about 95 grams of protein a day. And as I mentioned previously, all athletes, whether they're resistance or endurance, will need more protein than the general population. And so for a long time, I think we thought that resistance trainer, you know, athletes who are power lifters or sprinters, they need a ton of protein, whereas our endurance athletes probably don't need more than the average person, but they do need more to just support that increased muscle synthesis. There is kind of an upper limit benefit, and really consumption of protein beyond 2 grams per kilogram per day has not been shown to be beneficial for any form of athlete. So consumption of massive amounts of protein beyond that 2 grams per kilogram per day threshold is not beneficial, and probably doesn't lead to a ton of side effects, except that you're ingesting protein probably at the cost of other things that you might need, like carbohydrates or fat. And then just briefly, our general recommendations for fat should be about 20 to 30% of your total daily calories. And so there's not going to be a firm like grams per kilogram per day, but you should shoot for about 20 to 30%. We should encourage our athletes, all athletes, especially endurance runners, to avoid diets of less than 20% fat. Fat does offer a greater potential fuel source in endurance athletes as opposed to carbohydrate, even in lean athletes, because one carbohydrate unit ends up getting sort of as like 9 units of fat, right? So you end up having more general fat storage. Even if you are a lean athlete, they're still going to have some fat stores. And so we know that with regular ingestion of glucose, you have about 2,500 kcals of energy that's available to you. With fat, even in a lean athlete, you have about 70,000 kcals of energy units available. And so there are massively more amounts of energy available with fat, which is what makes it such an attractive fuel source in endurance athletes. But you have to kind of go through the glucose first before you get there. And so we want to avoid diets that are too low, because A, they can result in sort of insufficient energy intake, and B, you limit your ability to absorb some of those fat soluble vitamins. So they need some fat in their diet. So when we talk about specific training strategies, which I think are probably, that's really the focus for us as sports medicine physicians and providers and people who are working with athletes regularly. We'll kind of work through and talk about our specific training recommendations for our macronutrients and then for some of the micronutrients and supplements. So with regards to carb loading, this is something that's practiced very commonly, and it has been advised by coaches and in the popular media for many, many years. And it's this idea that you're going to try to take in as many carbohydrates as you possibly can before your event, so that you can kind of be primed, if you will, and ready to go with that ready energy source. So you can practice carb loading in a number of different ways, and some of it is really dependent on the athlete's ability to utilize those carbohydrates and their ability to like tolerate that on a stomach. So if your race is less than 90 minutes in length, you can simply increase your carbohydrate intake in a 24-hour period prior to the event. So try to increase the amount of carbs you're eating to a goal of about 7 to 12 grams per kilogram in that day before. That will allow the body to replenish muscle and liver glycogen stores and kind of top everything off. If the race is more than 90 minutes, then you're going to actually try to increase your carbohydrate intake over the preceding 36 to 48 hours prior to the race. So you're going to try to bump that up to 10 to 12 grams per kilogram per day for at least 2 to 3 days before the race. And they've done studies actually that have shown that that can improve performance by up to 2 to 3%, which sounds like a relatively small amount, but again, when you're dealing with elite athletes, can really make the difference between kind of the winner's podium and not placing or not advancing. In the hours immediately preceding the event, so the 1 to 4 hours before the event, you would shoot for a 1 to 4 gram per kilogram carbohydrate snack. And so that would be something that would be probably relatively carb dense, like a Cliff Bar or like a GU, to try to really max out the liver glycogen stores so that everything is topped off, primed, ready to go when you're actually competing. So the other thing that comes up commonly, or that we talk about often, is how do you time your nutrition during a race? And so for athletes that are competing less than an hour in length, so somebody running like a half marathon or less, potentially, or certainly a 10K or less, they don't need any additional carbohydrate intake. They shouldn't have exhausted their glucose and glycogen stores. If they're exercising 1 to 2.5 hours, the goal would be to try to ingest 30 to 60 grams an hour. Ideally, you would shoot for a 6 to 8% carbohydrate solution, and you try to consume small amounts of that every 10 to 15 minutes. That's probably the best strategy for optimal GI tolerability, and it also would spare your liver glycogen stores. And so that would, you know, you can get it in a drink form, in a gel form, whatever is really tolerable for the athlete. And so it's important for an athlete to practice this carbohydrate fueling strategy before the race day so that they can see what they're able to tolerate when they're exercising at that level, what leads to the least amount of GI stress. If they're exercising for more than 2.5 hours, like they're doing one of these endurance events that lasts all day or is a multi-day event, you want to try to get them to take in 60 to 70 grams per hour with a goal of trying to get up to 90 grams an hour, just because of the vast amounts of calories that they'll be consuming as they exercise for longer. But that might also be something that you would want to practice, a strategy that you practice for several weeks prior to the event to try to increase your ability to take them in. And, you know, I don't know how familiar some of you are with some of these ultra or multi-day events. I mean, these people are, as they're exercising and moving through, they're not doing like the gels and the goos anymore. They're like eating bananas and peanut butter sandwiches and stuff that their support bands are making for them. So they're eating full meals, or they're trying to as they're running. So with regards, there have been some questions about, you know, is one kind of carbohydrate better than another kind of carbohydrate? Because we know that certain types of carbohydrates are more fermentable in the GI tract, and so maybe can lead to more GI distress, or maybe are more readily available to be oxidized, or which is, you know, basically utilized in the energy cycles. And so they found that a mixture of multiple types of carbohydrates, of glucose and fructose, will increase your oxidation rate and can improve GI tolerance. That being said, you need to practice that fueling strategy prior to race day. And so glucose and fructose, that's, you know, fruit sugars and also just simple sugar. And so most of your pre-made energy things will, or pre-made carbohydrate snacks will include that mixture. As we talked about previously, you want to make sure that your fueling plan is based on the constraints of the sport and the course, so that you're thinking not just about the actual length of the course, but, you know, are there specific constraints? Is part of this a swimming thing, and they really can't eat anything orally, you know, while they're swimming? You also want to practice at the intensity of the race when you're doing these kind of these test runs with different fuel strategies, because your GI tolerance is oftentimes lower when you're exercising at higher intensities. Another just practical tip, especially for those of us down here in Florida, is that with those numbers that I've given you, want to actually reduce that by about 10% in warm conditions, just because you're going to oxidize the carbohydrate a little bit less, or you're a little bit less efficient at that. And so taking in higher amounts of carbohydrates will just lead to more GI stress. So here would be an example kind of carbohydrate intake during exercise, an example of how you could do this. And so you can just rinse, or you can actually ingest, and especially as you're progressing, this would be how you might want to time for exercise greater than 2.5 hours. You would be timing your intake of these small amounts, 20, 30 grams every, 15 minutes. So a couple of other things that have come up with regards to carbohydrate intake. So there's this concept of train low, race high. And so this is not talking about altitude, but actually about glycogen or glucose availability. So this idea that maybe we exercise in a relatively low glucose availability state, like we train that way, but then on race day, we give the body plenty of carbs. And so we know that when you practice or train or exercise in a low glucose availability state, we see upregulation of the fatty oxidation pathways, right? So once our glucose availability is sort of exhausted, our body switches over to utilization of the fat pathways. This allows us to spare those glycogen stores, and we can help prolong the time to exhaustion, because remember that there's a lot more potential energy sort of stored up in fat than there is in glucose and glycogen. We know, though, that we can't produce as much power, we can't produce as much intensity training in these low glucose availability states. And so for athletes that are participating in ultra endurance events, where they're running for, you know, several hours at a time, but they're never performing at, you know, really extreme, really high intensity. You know, it's intense for us just from a muscle standpoint, but it's not intense from a VO2 max standpoint. That might be an appropriate group to be practicing this kind of a training pathway. That being said, if you do this prolonged training, you're going to limit your adaptation and your ability to sort of respond when your body needs to increase the intensity. And so to me, this is something that maybe is included as part of a comprehensive training program, but would not be, I wouldn't encourage my endurance athletes to only sort of train in a low glucose availability state, if that makes sense. As I've said, the pitfalls with a lot of these sort of interesting theories is that they seem to work well in the lab, but they don't actually work well when you put them out there on the road. And so looking at studies in cyclists, they've seen increased mitochondrial activity. So, you know, they're definitely utilizing those fatty acid oxidation pathways when they're actually out there on the bikes, but they haven't seen any improvement in their performance with either steady state or sort of time trial cycling. And so, as I said, I think it's something that's best utilized as part of a comprehensive training strategy, but it wouldn't be a good thing to utilize if you're trying to get a high intensity training. So if your athlete is getting ready to go out and do a sprint workout or sort of train in that anaerobic threshold where they're doing like 800-meter repeats or something like that, then you want them to have glucose and glycogen, because that's that real ready source of energy for those muscular contractions, if that makes sense. And so we can always talk about that more if people have questions. Another thing that is reasonably popular is the idea of this carbohydrate malference. And so for athletes, especially athletes where they really have low tolerance to ingestion of foods, they've looked at, you know, well, what if we just rinse the mouth with a carbohydrate, you know, containing mouthwash, or you just with Gatorade, right? You drink some Gatorade and sort of, you don't even drink it, you just swish it around in your mouth and then spit it out. They found that the act of just getting some carbohydrates in the mouth without swallowing it can stimulate those taste cells and actually helps to improve performance without the ingestion of carbohydrates. And so they've seen some improvements in the 1-hour time trial performance with cyclists, and this is probably due to activation of carbohydrate receptors in the mouth that then is associated with central nervous system reward pathways, so it kind of delays time to exhaustion, right? So you can rinse with a 6.4 to 10% carbohydrate solution every 5 to 10 minutes, and that has been seen with associated with some performance improvements of 2 to 3% in high intensity events up to an hour. So if you're exercising for more than an hour, we still would advise the athlete to actually try to ingest some actual carbohydrates, just because that's not going to be enough. That rinsing effect is not going to be enough to counterbalance the caloric, you know, caloric utilization that high intensity exercise has done. So switching over, moving to our next kind of macronutrient, we'll talk a little bit about protein intake and timing. We've looked a lot at when carbohydrates should be ingested and how they should be ingested and where they should be ingested. There's been a lot less research looking at endurance athletes with regards to protein intake and timing. Certainly we know some things about resistance trainers, just because we theoretically thought that they needed, you know, they were the ones that needed protein more so than the endurance athletes. But we do know that regardless of the kind of exercise that you're doing, there's an upregulation in muscle protein synthesis, right? So after you exercise, you kind of create these micro tears in the muscles, and then the body goes to repair those muscles. And if they have appropriate building blocks, which are those proteins, then they're able to repair those micro tears and make the muscle stronger and larger if you're a resistance trainer, or just stronger if you're more of a sort of endurance trainer. And so our goal should really be to try to optimize our protein intake in that 24-hour period following exercise to limit that catabolic, that just breakdown effect of prolonged endurance exercise, right? And so looking at optimal timings, we should try to take in about 0.25 to 0.3 grams per kilogram of protein immediately after exercise, or even immediately before exercise, just to try to provide about 10 grams of essential amino acids, which are important to maximally stimulate that muscle protein synthesis. So your goal would be to have a little protein kick within 2 hours after exercise. That being said, if your athlete really can't take in a ton of protein before exercise, then they can do it after exercise. If there was somebody who would prefer to take it in right before, then they may do that. So the timing of the intake around the window of muscle protein synthesis is really a matter of personal preference, truthfully. Any athletes that are engaged in exhaustive endurance events or prolonged or significant eccentric activities should consider a preload. And so these exhaustive endurance events, these would be like your athletes that maybe are doublers. So if you have your track and field athletes and they're going to do a 5K and a 10K within that same day, that can be relatively exhaustive. If your athletes are doing some of these distance classics or distance challenges, if your athlete is involved in a multi-day endurance event, if your athlete is going overseas to the, what is it called? It's like the Friends, I don't know. It's a marathon in South Africa where you either run up the mountain or down the mountain. So anyone who's got a real significant eccentric contraction, they may consider a slightly larger load of protein before exercise, and then trying to pair some protein along with the carbohydrates during exercise. So these athletes who are out there for, 2, 3, 5 hours, whatever they're taking in, if they're able to pair that carbohydrate with a little bit of protein. And some of the drinks will have that. Again, like I said, most of our like really ultra endurance athletes are gonna have like a peanut butter sandwich or something like that. And so that naturally will contain some protein in there. And then after exercise, make sure that you're adding protein to the carbohydrate intake. And one of the interesting things is that if your athlete is unable to take in at least 1 gram per kilogram per hour because of tolerance or something else, if you add some protein to their carbohydrate intake after exercise, it actually can boost not just muscle synthesis, but glycogen synthesis as well. And so that's a great trick for your athletes who just can't consume the quantity of carbohydrate that you're trying to get into them. Pair it with some protein and you can boost some muscle glycogen synthesis. There are many questions about the best kind of protein and whether whey protein and dairy protein is better than other kinds of protein, and if you can possibly get enough protein if you are a vegetarian athlete or a vegan athlete. And the answer is that all kinds of protein, regardless of the source, will stimulate muscle protein synthesis. So soy protein will do it, dairy protein will do it, any kind of protein will do it. It all contains protein. The reason that whey and sort of dairy protein has become the go-to for so many athletes, especially in the resistance world, is that dairy sources of protein have a pretty high leucine content, which leads to really good absorption, digestion, kinetics. So it's kind of you get the most bang for your buck from the ingestion of dairy sources. There are some questions, many protein sources tout the amount of branched chain amino acids, and so they have this theoretical and physiologic benefit, which is that they support protein metabolism, nerve function, and appropriate regulation of glucose and insulin. But if they're taken by themselves, they probably are not enough to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. And so I really encourage my athletes to take in real high, just a complete protein source with a high essential amino acid and leucine content. And so you don't have to go searching for all of these components of a protein. Just take in a complete protein, which is usually a protein in its truest form. Now, vegetarian sources of protein, and we'll get to this, are not all complete proteins, but usually their pairing like rice with most beans would create a complete protein that would have a high amount of essential amino acids. So here would be some examples of sort of your essential, non-essential amino acids. essential amino acids are basically, they can't be created by the body. And so whenever you're consuming a protein source, you want to make sure that your protein source contains those essential amino acids. What we would call a complete protein source would contain all of the essential amino acids, right? And so I have some example, most animal-based proteins are essential amino acids. With vegetables and with vegan sources, you just need to make sure that you're pairing them appropriately. So you would pair beans with rice, for example, or whole grains. You could pair them with cashews or pumpkin seeds. So you just have to be a little bit more thoughtful about it, but you can certainly achieve that. And quinoa is also a source of a complete protein. So as we talked about previously, there's been a lot of excitement and a lot of discussion about this idea of training in a glucose deprived state or training in a high fat state. And a lot of endurance athletes have been experimenting with this idea of sort of keto adaptation, right? They've been trying to really push their glucose consumption way down or their carbohydrate consumption way down because there's this theory, right? Because we know that fat provides so much more potential energy that they can just exercise forever without hitting the wall. So that is true to a sense, but you have to remember that you are doing that at the expense of that kind of real high intensity energy production. And so your athletes may be able to exercise for longer, but they may not have that same kind of pickup. And so really when we think about keto adaptation and considering driving our athletes into sort of a ketogenic state, probably the most benefit is going to be seen in those athletes that are competing at a lower intensity state. And so athletes that need to have some high intensity kick, so really any of your athletes that are competing in the 5K, the 10K, even the marathon, they would need to make sure that they're taking in adequate sources of carbohydrates. I wouldn't really recommend keto adaptation for those kinds of athletes. It's really going to be for your athletes who are engaged in ultra endurance activities. And you have to counsel them that if they're following this kind of a keto adaptive diet or a ketogenic diet, it is going to impact their ability to train intensely and can impact their performance in their race times. And so, as I said previously, I think it's one of those tools in their toolkit, and it's part of a comprehensive exercise and nutrition strategy. And so maybe it's something that they utilize when they're in sort of the building period and really working on just being able to log those miles and to get their bodies used to being on the road for hours at a time. But as they kind of titrate down and are getting ready for race day and are working on increasing their kick and things like that, then I wouldn't recommend it because you're not going to be able to train at that high intensity. As we talked about previously, I don't recommend a low-fat diet for athletes. Athletes who chronically restrict fat are at risk of deficiencies of fat-soluble vitamins, carotenoids, essential fatty acids, which we already learned are really important in terms of muscle synthesis, and also conjugated linoleic acids. And fat plays an essential role in cell membrane stability and nerve function and metabolic signaling and support and transport. And so we know that our athletes need appropriate amounts of fat to be able to perform properly, to be able to rebuild that muscle appropriately, and to be able to support appropriate metabolic function. In terms of the right kinds of fat, I always recommend omega-3 fatty acids and essential fatty acids. Conjugated linoleic acid has been studied extensively and has been purported to have benefits with regards to sort of reduced atherogenesis and carcinogenesis, so better for, kind of cardiovascular function, and might reduce, might maintain appropriate weight by reducing adipocyte lipid uptake. It comes from dairy products and ruminant meats, and so like goats and cows and things that are eating a lot of grass. There are also some vegan sources as well, but predominantly, it comes from dairy sources. there are pretty limited human studies to support any sort of claims for routine supplementation of performance benefit. And so, that should just be part of a well-rounded diet. Now, with regards to high-dose conjugated linoleic acid with omega-3 fatty acids, again, there have been studies looking at increased testosterone formation. And so that's something, testosterone obviously is an anabolic steroid, and it may be able to offset some of the effects of intense training and high volume endurance events, and so may help to improve sort of muscle protein synthesis. If your athlete is training really intensely and you're worried about their ability to maintain appropriate testosterone levels, because we know that intense training and intense endurance training can lower those testosterone levels, you may consider, tweaking their diet a little bit to try to increase their doses of conjugated linoleic acid. But I think like I said, for the regular athlete, even for the regular endurance athlete, for the most part, they should be getting appropriate amounts of the conjugated linoleic acid that they need through just a well-rounded diet. Another thing that comes up quickly or comes up often is the medium chain triglycerides. And so these are these like coconut oil and other sort of smaller fats, right? So long chain fatty acids are really our classic essential fatty acids. Medium chain triglycerides have had their moment in the sun because they're thought to be like primed and ready to go without having to be broken down at all, like just ready to be used by the mitochondria and produce energy right away. And so in theory, it's supposed to provide them, it's supposed to kind of skip that divide where, if you switch over to a fatty acid oxidation pathway, you don't have as ready available an energy source. And so, it's thought to be able to provide that readily available energy source and still spare muscle glycogen stores. Studies have been mixed. Many studies, and it's probably just because of what medium chain triglycerides are regularly found in, they find a lot of GI distress and side effects. And some studies have shown some improvement with time trials. Other studies have not seen that improvement. And so really, I wouldn't recommend it as an ergogenic aid during exercise. Maybe it's something that you can utilize as part of your recovery dietary strategies to try to spare those glycogen stores and help boost healthy muscle synthesis, because those medium chain triglycerides would be packaged with essential amino acids, but it shouldn't be, it's not something that you would want to ingest while exercising. All right, hydration. So as I said, hydration isn't what we would classically think of necessarily, or water wouldn't be something we would classically think of as like a nutrition, I guess, but it's definitely just as important as the food that you're taking in to make sure that your athletes are staying appropriately hydrated. And so traditionally, we would say, the thought would be that you want to try to drink before that sensation of thirst arrives. You want to stay ahead of dehydration, because by the time you feel thirsty, you're already dehydrated. And we know that once you're dehydrated, there is definitely a decline in your performance. Aggressive and excessive fluid consumption by endurance athletes has actually increased the prevalence of exercise-associated hyponatremia. So we've had athletes that have so overhydrated themselves that they've developed hyponatremia. And so exercise-associated hyponatremia is when you have low sodium within 24 hours of physical activity. Athletes who are slower and athletes who are lighter are at increased risk of developing this. And so unlike dehydration, which, I guess if it really progresses, then it can be a problem. Like hyponatremia can be a serious medical issue. And so it's something that we need to evaluate for. And so we've had to rail back this thinking that you should really, overhydrate, because there's really no benefit to drinking more than your body needs. Just a brief note, so the symptoms will vary and range from asymptomatic with regards to exercise-associated hyponatremia to confusion, delirium, stomach complaints, and in severe cases, even coma and death if the sodium is driven low enough. This is due to a variety of factors that happen when we exercise, and so increased hydration with the addition of loss of sodium in the sweat with the loss of your appropriate suppression of antidiuretic hormone leads to pretty low serum sodium levels, and then exercise will cause the kidneys to try to hold on to more fluid. And so you're taking in fluid, you're exercising, you're sweating out your solute, and then your kidneys are trying to hold on to even more fluid because you're sweating. And so all of those work together to drive down your circulating sodium levels. And this can happen even with pretty low fluid intake levels. So, you know, if you're drinking just a liter an hour, which doesn't seem like that much necessarily, that can result in clinically significant hyponatremia. So athletes should be encouraged to kind of drink as desired, and the rate that they should shoot for is about 400 to 800 milliliters an hour. If you are a super fast, super heavy athlete exercising in a warm environment, aka you're going to be sweating a lot, then you might want to drink up the higher range of that. If your athlete is slower, if they're lighter, if they're exercising in a cooler environment, you can shoot for the lower range. Any athlete who's considered a particularly salty sweater, and your athletes will know who they are, might want to include some sodium ingestion in addition to the water. And athletes who are exercising for greater than 2 hours should make sure that they're taking in some amount of solute. And so you can start with 300 to 600 milligrams per hour of sodium and adjust accordingly. Sports drinks with about 230 to 690 milligrams per liter, which are all of the commercially available ones, that will result in optimal absorption. So really, we should just be encouraging our athletes. It doesn't have to be, we don't have to be super calculated about it. You would just want to, encourage them to follow their instinctive thirst mechanism. And if you're worried about any of your athletes, a really simple way to monitor hydration status can be pre and post workout weights, urine color, their body temperature, their race pace, their environmental temperature, and you can utilize that to try to guide their hydration intake and their need for sodium intake. So pre and post weights are definitely advisable and recommended because that can help you to calculate their water deficit. Nitrates were incredibly popular in the 2012 Olympics and have kind of come and gone since that time. They have numerous theoretical benefits, right? So nitrates are utilized by the body and they help improve vasodilation, right? So that means that the blood vessels kind of relax, we improve blood flow, we improve oxygen flow to these exercising muscles, we increase mitochondrial respiration and glucose uptake, which results in better muscle economy, better muscle efficiency, reduced sensation of fatigue, and improved cardiorespiratory performance. They are found in beets, arugula, which is called rocket, and other places, and other vegetables in the form of NO3, and then it's converted in the mouth to NO2 and then nitrous oxide in the GI tract. And so pretty small studies in non-elite athletes have shown improvement in time to exhaustion and cardiopulmonary performance at the anaerobic threshold. So higher intensity exercise if you supplement them acutely 2 to 3 hours prior to exercise. In athletes who are trained, we don't really see this benefit. And so this is something where your more amateur athlete might receive more of a benefit. Really, what I would say is that your athletes should be encouraged to eat a diet that is sufficiently, that is full of high nitrate vegetables or beets, and should probably forego these expensive supplements, which may be of dubious benefit. The other sort of practical thing that I'll put out there is that anything that gets juiced and then kind of put in a container, nitrous oxide or nitrates are like volatile, so they degrade really quickly. So once you juice something, you have to consume it pretty quickly. When it's in a powder, you're not getting any nitrous oxide from that. It should also be kept in mind that high intake of supplementation immediately prior to a race can result in GI distress and overhydration. And so this is probably not something that you want to eat right before a race. Antioxidants, just briefly, because I know, and I apologize for the computer technical difficulties but I will move through the rest of this relatively quickly. And you guys all have the slides so that you can look at them at your leisure. And certainly if you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out and contact me. But antioxidants are these ideas, basically they're compounds that we ingest like vitamin C, vitamin E, and they are thought to try to inhibit signals that are triggered by oxidative stress. And so exercise is a stressor, right? And we know that a pro-oxidant environment during exercise should encourage the appropriate adaptation. So we want to try to kind of maintain that balance, right? Creating that appropriate stress, which then triggers an appropriate adaptation. So we want to encourage our athletes to, again, just kind of consume a healthy diet that contains a variety of naturally occurring antioxidants. And we want them to actually avoid ingestion of really high doses of single antioxidants like vitamin C, which might actually inhibit that adaptive response. And so you don't want them to kind of fall victim to that stress response, but you need to see a little stress to develop that adaptation, if that makes sense. Specific antioxidants, the ones that have been the most well studied are probably tart cherry juice, and those are the ones that I've seen touted and advertised. And so tart cherry juice can help promote recovery. It would be a reasonable thing to utilize for multi-day endurance events or cycling tours, but there's not a ton of evidence there, but it's something that you could add. It has, you know, a healthy source of carbohydrates and a little bit of fat in there. Green tea extract is also an antioxidant that's been well studied, and so it's been found that green tea extract actually stimulates fat oxidation and can improve your performance during endurance exercise. That might be useful with that for our athletes who are participating in our longer, lower intensity events, because it helps to spare that glycogen concentration, so it allows you to have that routine store of glycogen. Interestingly, they found that the activating enzyme, the enzyme that actually utilizes green tea, Asian populations have higher levels of this enzyme. And so when you're advising your athletes about specific supplements, your Asian athletes may get the most benefit from green tea. It should be noted, you know, and I think this is a good tip in general, that when your athletes are looking to purchase supplements, your sources are going to vary widely, and so before they actually take something in, they need to do their research and make sure that they're taking in what they think that they're taking in, and they're not unwittingly consuming a banned substance of some sort, because ultimately they're responsible for what they put in their bodies. Caffeine is probably the best known supplement, or the one that's the most widely used, I'd say. It acts in a number of different ways. So it acts centrally to try to improves your cognitive performance, suppresses pain by increasing beta endorphins, and then it acts peripherally to increase motor neuron recruitment and mobilizes calcium to try to increase muscle contraction. And then systemically, it helps to mobilize free fatty acid and increases thermogenesis. And so multiple studies have been conducted, and caffeine has definitely been proven in the real world to help improve sustained maximal endurance and vigilance during endurance tasks. And so if our athletes want to consume caffeine, I think that would be a reasonable thing to try. 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram, 30 to 90 minutes prior to exercise. And it actually works better when you consume it with carbs. And so, for example, this Coca-Cola that this guy is drinking, or those new energy shots are excellent ways to combine your carbohydrate and your caffeine. It should be noted that there is definitely a bell curve in terms of caffeine consumption. So higher doses greater than 9 milligrams per kilogram do not further enhance performance and may also flag as a positive result on urine drug screening. I think we all probably know the side effects of excessive caffeine consumption: GI distress, nervousness, confusion, sleep disturbances. It also should be noted that an athlete who consumes caffeine daily may not get that same sort of ergogenic effect, and so they may want to actually begin at relatively low doses and consider caffeine cycling. And so they may want to follow periods of abstinence, so avoiding caffeine during lower intensity training, and then resume coffee intake during racing or high intensity training. And so your doses are really going to be dependent on how much caffeine your athlete drinks normally. And for athletes who are exercising at a really prolonged events, they may want to do this periodic topping off. So taking in a small amount of caffeine every couple of hours to kind of help boost them. After exercise, we know that a window of opportunity exists to try to facilitate a timely recovery. And so we want to try to get in carbohydrate and protein in the first 24 hours after intense exercise to try to replete all of those stores that we've depleted and try to prevent muscle breakdown. As I mentioned, with regards to carbohydrate, you can add some caffeine to try to boost glycogen repletion. You can also add some protein to replete that glycogen repletion. Hydration is also really important. We know that about 0.1 to 3% of body weight loss after exercise is to be expected, and so we need to be repleting that. You want to replete with 150% of what was lost based on their body weight. You get a better retention of fluid when you combine it with sodium. And interestingly, there's no improvement with the addition of potassium. And so just sodium in and of itself, so salt packets, just regular salt packets are enough to replete. So we'll talk briefly just about special diets, and then we'll wrap it up, and thank you for staying with me a few minutes extra. There are a couple of specific special diets that athletes have embarked on recently, and so vegetarian diets, and I'm going to use that as sort of an all-inclusive because our athletes may follow any one of a number of diets, and so really this is a diet that either restricts or eliminates animal products and byproducts, and so you can be on a spectrum, and some athletes may consume certain products like fish or like eggs and dairy, while others may avoid all animal sources, and that would be a strict vegan. The diet is certainly increasing in popularity in general, and also in endurance and just athletes in general. The proposed benefits are that just because you're eating a plant-based diet, you may have improved exercise capacity and performance, exercise-induced oxidative stress, inflammatory processes, and immunological response, as well as cardiovascular function, just because you're not seeing, those stresses from animal sources of protein. So what I'll say is this, is that really the studies are mixed just because they enroll relatively small numbers of athletes, and that's going to be true for all of these special diets. Really, I think the important takeaways are that the studies didn't show that there's any worsening in aerobic capacity with regards to the vegetarian diet. And most of the studies did confirm those benefits, certainly from a cardiovascular standpoint, with improved systolic function and diastolic function, as well as improvements in plasma lipid levels, improvements in blood pressure, and reduced exercise-induced oxidative stress and inflammation. And so whether that results in any improved performance time remains to be seen, but we know that from a physiologic standpoint, there are benefits to consuming a vegetarian diet. With regards to potential risks, certainly there's a risk of micronutrient deficiency if the diet isn't well structured or varied, and so you have to make sure that you're paying attention to your omega-3 fatty acids and these micronutrients, iron, zinc, iodine, calcium, vitamin D, and B12. Also, there's certainly a potential risk of reduced energy availability, just because we know that vegetarian sources of carbohydrates and protein tend to be less calorie dense. And so you really need to monitor your athletes, especially your endurance athletes, closely to make sure that they're taking in appropriate amounts of carbohydrates and protein with high quality plant protein. And as I mentioned, there's really no difference between plant and animal sources, so long as you're taking in a complete protein and that you're getting all of those essential amino acids. Some studies suggest that vegetarian athletes should attempt to try to increase that protein intake to aim for the higher level of protein recommendations, so up to 22 additional grams of protein daily, just because you may not utilize that protein or synthesize that protein as effectively when it comes from a plant-based source as opposed to an animal-based source. In conclusion, with regards to vegetarian diets, there's no evidence supporting either recommending for it or against it specifically for endurance athletic performance. And so it's neither better nor worse for you, and a dietary choice should just be one of personal preference. Vegetarian and vegan athletes can certainly perform as well as their omnivorous peers, provided they pay appropriate attention to dietary intake, energy availability, and micronutrient supplementation. Intermittent fasting is another diet that's gotten a lot of press recently, and so basically it's this period of voluntary withdrawal from food and beverages, and so you'll have a period of time that you're eating and a period of time that you're fasting. It has become more prevalent in recent years due to proposed benefits on metabolic function and cardiovascular health, and there are really four main groups that they've sort of looked at in studies. There's alternate day fasting, where you might eat really very restrictive calories one day and then a normal diet the next day. There's modified fasting, time-restricted eating, where you might eat for like 8 hours out of the day and fast for the remaining 16, and then religious fasting, of course, for various holidays, or like Ramadan, which would be a month, where our athletes have restricted their eating intake to, hours after sundown. So with regards to proposed benefits for intermittent fasting, most of the studies, and so it's important to take note of this, the studies looking at these proposed benefits have looked at the effects during periods of religious fasting versus time-restricted eating. And so fasting diets, we know, act as a potential physiologic stimulus for ketogenesis, and they help to regulate metabolic, hormonal, and inflammatory responses, and also help to stimulate mitochondrial biogenesis and regulate body composition. So for your general population, it's probably a good thing to practice some intermittent fasting. They found that energy restriction for about 12 to 16 hours results in metabolic ketosis, which induces that fat oxidation and helps to preserve muscle mass. Currently, we have a limited understanding on the effects of intermittent fasting on hormonal, inflammatory, and metabolic responses. We do know that there does seem to be a decreased body weight and body fat composition in intermittent fasting endurance athletes, but it's unclear if these changes in weight and body fat composition result in improved endurance performance. With regards to potential risks, I think probably the obvious ones, that you have a reduced energy capacity. Your athletes may feel more fatigued. They may have altered sleep habits, especially if they're athletes who are restricting their dietary intake due to a religious holiday, and so that where they're very restricted in terms of the times when they may eat, and also dehydration if they're strictly fasting and not taking in any fluids. We know that prolonged fasting can have some detrimental effects on endurance performance because of the depletion of carbohydrates and water. However, intermittent fasting results in preventable adverse effects. And so, if somebody's fasting for days on end and not taking in any food or water, that is obviously going to lead to a performance decrement. However, patients who are engaged in like time-restricted eating will have these more preventable and more acute adverse effects. And so we can really plan, if we know that they're going to follow these kinds of diet, we can very carefully plan the timing of their workouts and their food and hydration intake to closely match those workouts so that we can mitigate some of those effects. It's important that you plan a water balance and a fluid strategy very carefully for races occurring during periods of religious fasting for those athletes who are avoiding all fluids during a religious fast. So really, we don't have a lot of information, and there are a lot of unknowns still about intermittent fasting. We just don't have enough information to be able to make a good recommendation to our athletes. If your athlete participates in religious fasting or prolonged fasting, we want to make sure that we're aware of that we work with the athlete to time their hydration and time their nutrition, to carefully tie it to their training and to their competition to try to minimize those preventable adverse effects. And so in terms of like a performance benefit, we don't know that there are any performance benefits necessarily to intermittent fasting. It is important, though, like I said, if your athletes are going to be engaging in religious fasting, that we are working with them to make sure that we're timing their nutrition intake appropriately so that we can mitigate some of those adverse events. Gluten-free diet. So this has again been discussed in the popular media for many years. Gluten has been touted as a problem on a number of levels for patients. This was developed to actually treat celiac disease, which is an allergy to gluten, and it would be a diet with a complete exclusion of gluten. So you would avoid wheat, rye, and barley, and I apologize for some of these spelling errors. More recently, classically we use it to treat celiac disease, but more recently there's been this concept of gluten intolerance and this theory that gluten serves as this pro-inflammatory agent in the GI tract. So if we eliminate gluten, we're not going to have as much inflammation in the GI tract, and we won't have as much distress or problems when we're exercising. And so they've done numerous studies looking at following gluten-free diets in non-celiac athletes, and none have shown any benefit on performance. And so just eliminating gluten because you think it's going to make you a faster runner, a better cycler, isn't going to make any difference. That being said, many endurance athletes continue to avoid gluten due to the belief that gluten in and of itself, because it's an inflammatory agent, can lead to GI symptoms and inflammation. If your athlete is coming to you and saying, I want to try this, then do a practice elimination diet and see if removing that gluten actually results in improved GI health. If it does, then great. And the caveat being that really there's we haven't seen any benefits of following a gluten-free diet in our non-celiac athletes, and they should be counseled that the removal of gluten can result in low energy availability and make it more difficult to replete those glycogen stores following endurance activities. So just because you're trying to select from gluten-free foods that may be less energy dense. If your athlete has celiac disease, then the best way to treat that, of course, is with dietary gluten elimination, but that's going to be a relatively small subset. And so for your general endurance athletes, there's really no benefit to avoiding gluten. Just briefly, this is kind of a subset, if you will, of these kind of specialized diets, and gluten is kind of included in this low food map diet. So the low food map diet is the adherence to a diet that is lower in these high fermentable short chain carbohydrates. And so the foods that are higher in fermentable short chain carbohydrates can trigger GI symptoms in the general population. And so people who do not have, inflammatory bowel disease or celiac disease, because you're taking in all of these carbohydrates that are then getting fermented in the gut, and that results in bloating and GI distress. Many endurance athletes will suspect that foods that are high in fructose, lactose, digestible fibers, and prebiotics may contribute to their GI symptoms because they're fermented in the colon, leading to that bloating and that gas and that cramping. And so they've sought to try to eliminate some of that GI distress by following a low food map diet. And there have been several studies that actually show that there is a beneficial effect of following a low food map diet on exercise-associated GI symptoms. They've seen it on short-term studies and also long-term studies. But this is another one where really, if you have an athlete that's complaining about a lot of GI symptoms, it may be useful to work with them, provide them with a copy of that low food map diet, which you can see an example of right here on the left side, what foods you can eat, what foods you should avoid, and see if that helps to make some improvements in their GI distress. In terms of potential risks of this diet, you would just want to counsel them that if you're reducing your intake of prebiotics, you may alter that gut microbiome a little bit. And so you also would want to gradually reduce your intake from about 15 to 30 grams to about 5 to 18 grams. And that usually is enough. That threshold of under 20 grams of those highly fermentable foods is usually enough to see an improvement. In looking at which of these, if you're going to just select some of these high food map foods to eliminate, they found that really lactose and fructose tends to be the most commonly reported problematic foods. And so you may counsel your athlete to consider reducing just lactose and fructose and monitor for tolerability. And that might be an easier thing to do than to go kind of whole hog with that sort of a diet. So in conclusion, if your athlete has a lot of GI symptoms, then you may counsel them to consider following a low food map diet and see if it makes a difference for them. So in conclusion, and wrapping up relatively after this, endurance athletes require increased carbs, protein, and fat compared to the general population. And so we, as sort of their training and support staff, need to make sure that we're carefully monitoring their nutrition intake to ensure adequate pre, during, and post-event nutrition and hydration. Really, we should counsel our athletes that with the exception of caffeine, most supplements have no proven benefits. And if they're looking to improve their athletic performance, they do best to follow a well-balanced diet with nitrate-rich foods. Special diets such as vegetarian, vegan diets, intermittent fast, and ketogenic and gluten-restricted diets have not been well studied in athletes. And really, certainly, there's no specific advantage that's been seen in any of these diets. There's also no detriment if they're going to follow these diets, but you should make sure that you're carefully working with your athletes to ensure adequate energy availability so that they're not taking in inadequate energy stores and losing all the benefits of that intense training. These are just some good websites for you guys, just that have really good information about general nutrition in the athlete. The top one is the Gatorade Sports Science Institute, and they have a ton of great resources that are freely available, really delving into nutrition for different kinds of athletes. And so also have a ton of information on sports, on group sport athletes and hydration status and things like that. And then the ACSM has a number of resources on nutrition. And then here's some selected resources, and then any questions. don't even really know.
Okay. There are a couple of questions up here. The first question comes from Tiffany, and she was asking, when you were in the section on caffeine, you had talked about some new shots or new caffeine sources.
Like the gel. Yeah, so is that what the question is? Let me scroll down. Basically, there are these little gel shots that you can get, and they're made by Cliff Bar, but they're freely available. And I also would tell you, like for kids, you need to look at those things carefully. Any of the supplements that kids are taking, if you're working with youth athletes, you want to make sure that they're not taking in too much caffeine. So really take a careful look at any supplements or even any kind of recovery or event bars that they might be consuming during an event to make sure that they're not taking in too much caffeine, because that can be detrimental for our kids, not only because you want them to sleep at night, but also because their bodies are just not primed to take in that amount of caffeine. But for our adult competitors, there are these little numbers. And in fact, let me see if I can go back. I can show you a picture of it. It's in my slideshow. Let's see here. But you can get those guys online. You can get them at any running store. Here they are. I don't know if you guys can see that. Right here, the goose. Whoops, do you see it? Maybe. Yeah, okay. So that's what they are. And that's like a really easy package. But the truth is that you could have a little bit of coffee beforehand. You could have a little bit of a soda, a Coke if you wanted to, whatever is tolerable for you. And so I think really, if you wanted to boil this down and say, okay, if I was just going to counsel anybody about nutrition, what I would say is this. Really, your foundation of nutrition should be healthy, minimally processed foods that are high in complex carbohydrates and that really are all of the colors of the rainbow and that are a protein source that you enjoy. And so that every athlete should eat that way. And then in terms of any of the supplements that they're trying to take, it should be something that they've tested before the race day, that they can tolerate well. It does not have to be something super expensive. And oftentimes the super expensive stuff doesn't work any better than, like I said, the cup of coffee from Wawa. So you don't have to do anything crazy or special. It should just be something that your stomach is used to.
Okay, the next question comes from Erin, and she wanted to have a little bit of a clarification here, saying, you know, the understanding of endurance athletes being considered runners, cyclists, and some of the long distance swimmers, as well as the prolonged strenuous activity athletes. But what about a college baseball player who's playing a doubleheader? They are doing 6 hours of game time, an hour and a half of warm up. Would you have them follow the same guidelines?
So it kind of depends within the day's activities, because a college baseball player, when you think about the demands of their sport, they're not engaged in continuous exercise for that whole length of time, right? They may be playing a doubleheader and they may be kind of like out at that game for 6 or 8 hours. For a golfer, for example, they might be out there for 6 or 8 hours, but they are not competing continuously at, like, you know, somewhere between 60 and 80% of their VO2 max for that entirety of time. That being said, during their training time, they may fall more towards the more towards the endurance form, and you may alter their carbohydrate intake and their protein intake accordingly. And then as they get into game time and they're having these periods of more intense activity and then backing off and then intense activity and backing off, you may actually tailor your nutrition intake towards more of the resistance or the power trainers. And so this is all very fluid. And certainly I don't mean to suggest that the only people engaging in endurance athletics are cyclists, runners, and swimmers, because if you're out there working hard for multiple hours a day, regardless of the kind of activity, it's definitely endurance. But when we think of baseball players, they do have a chance to, they're coming back, they're resting completely, and then starting again. And so their caloric intake is going to be a little bit different, if that makes sense.
And then the last question was about the Gatorade sweat patches. They've had a lot of more expensive sweat patches available, but Gatorade did just come out with theirs that appears to be a lot more affordable, between $20 to $30. Have you utilized that with any of your athletes to look at their hydration status?
You know, I think there's so many things within our toolbox that are available, and I think the most important thing that you can do is to find something that you feel comfortable with and that is reflective of what's actually happening with your athletes. And so if you want to utilize that patch and you find that it correlates really well with, you know, what you've previously used, like their like the color of their urine or their pre and post weights. I mean, our athletes don't all have the college paying for them to be able to do some of this stuff, right? Or our athletes might be high schoolers who really don't have a lot of money. And so I try to do things that are relatively inexpensive and really easy for me to do, for trainers to do, for the athletes themselves to do. And so anytime you add another level where you're trying this patch, maybe it's working, but maybe I didn't stick it on right, and maybe I need to, you know what I mean? If it's just as easy to weigh yourself and say, okay, I've lost 5 pounds, and so that correlates with 5% of my body weight, and so I need to try to rehydrate, like to get back up there until I'm back to the weight that I was before, that's really easy to do, right? You know, it's easy for somebody to get on a scale and then do it again. And so I don't need anything extra, but if I was working with a higher level athlete, then maybe I would consider something like that. But honestly, there are so many pieces and we can really get bogged down, and truthfully, it's much more about common sense, in my opinion. And that's the goal of this talk, is to help everybody to realize that a lot of these recommendations are common sense. If somebody comes to you with a crazy kind of like dietary intervention and you're like, I've never heard of this before, I've not seen any athletes that have ever done this, then probably the chances are good that your athlete doesn't need to do it, right? And so using common sense first and foremost will get us probably 90% of the way there. And then if you have an athlete where you're like, gosh, I can't figure out, they're telling me that they're drinking, you know, all the water in the world, they're eating their salt packets, but still they're really acting like their fluid dehydrated, and I can't get a good read on their urine, then sure, maybe you need this additional level, but it's not something that I use routinely, I guess, is a very long-winded answer. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for taking the time and working through some of the technical challenges. I know that we really appreciate it. We had a lot of folks jump in on this. So I know that in the athletic training world, this is obviously a big topic of conversation. So like I said, I appreciate your time. I appreciate everybody coming tonight, and we will see you in the next one.
Yeah, thank you everybody so much, and I hope that this information is useful, and certainly if you have further questions or want to talk through anything further, then I'm available and would be happy to answer any questions. So thank you.